Hi everyone, and welcome. I'm Helga Kristofferson, an assistant curator here at the museum, and it's an immense pleasure and honor to welcome Donald Moffett and Nari here. Yes. To be in conversation as part of the celebration of our 40th anniversary, and you are both have played an immense important role in the history of the museum. And I think when we, the curatorial team, we sat together and talked about this history and in a way what we hope to kind of get at this weekend, both of you really kind of popped up several times, and it's my hope that through this conversation we can both talk about your work today, but maybe also through your work revisit kind of a moment in the history of the new museum that was also very important. But I want to start maybe just by each of you kind of talking separately, and I want to start with you, Donald. As part of Grand Fury, you were part of creating the work Silence Equal Death, the sign that was part of a new museum window display. And I wanted to kind of maybe have you talk a little bit about that as a starting point.
I'll start by saying we didn't have anything to do with Silence Equals Death. There was overlap between that collective, and at that point it predates Grand Fury, but that became the Silence Equals Death project, and Avram Finkelstein was the overlapping member of both Grand Fury and that. Now, we did have that made for the Let the Record show.
So you were part.
I was? What? Well, I mean, yeah, but it was, we ordered it. We ordered it up in neon. That's different than actually creating it, which is what they did. So anyway, I was just setting the record. If any of them are here, I would be dead meat. So, disclaimer on authorship. Now, where were we going from there?
Yeah, but that the record show in '88,
right.
And I don't know if you want to tell us a little bit about that, and also in a way the work that you and Grand Fury did, evolving around the kind of the AIDS crisis at that moment, and that being a reaction to a moment in time.
Well, this is all to the credit of the new museum way back there and the curator Bill Olander, who immediately, within the first month of ACT UP, was kind of at ACT UP saying, come our way, do something on the street. And that group, it was just a subgroup that met on the side, maybe 20 people, who worked on the Let the Record show project, which definitely kind of struck a nerve. It definitely resonated. It worked. It basically worked, that installation. It was on the street. It faced the street. It was over in the Broadway building.
When you say worked, what do you, in terms of the visibility that it created?
Visibility, yes, but even more importantly, the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And from there, after that happened, and after it worked, there was just the very simple idea of, well, like, why don't we continue this? And because there was a handful of artists, and people were looking for something to do at this point because there was so much desperation. So a group broke off from that original group and became Grand Fury, and within a short time. And then we were off and running with the number of projects that we did.
Mm-hmm. And as Grand Fury, the project you continued doing, in a way, many of them involving visuals and text-based work, and also very much working in public space.
That's what we did.
Yeah.
That's right. Was there a question?
Yeah, no, just knowing like.
Well, that was the whole. That was the
taking off
only
from that starting
intention. In
point.
fact, there was an early rule in Grand Fury that we wouldn't work in the galleries. We wouldn't have any of that. We were too, we were too pure for that. So it was all on the street. That was basically it. We got some commissions to do public venues like Sides of Buses. That was an early one. The Kissing Doesn't Kill piece that was in Chicago. We got to do the bus stops, those beautiful backlit bus stops here in the city early on. And we were very pure for a long time till Venice called and said, you want to come to Venice and be part of the Biennale? And we said, shit, yeah, let's go. So that was kind of the end of our purity. And it was worth it.
And can I ask you also, because I think we will also return to that when talking to Nari, like at that time who did you imagine who was your audience? What was the community that you were speaking to when making?
It was as broadly as possible. The least of who we thought we were talking to was the art world, and the art world was the most supportive and the kind of broadest megaphone for the work. So, but we was on the street. It was for the street. It was to, awareness, incite action, general population, and that worked. But for the broad distribution of the various projects and messages, we had a lot of support in the art world.
And from the
press, and then from opportunities. Does that make sense? Opportunities. Yeah, we had opportunities.
And some of this in a way, because I remember when also we spoke prior to this conversation of talking about your work and the kind of in a very kind of activistic spirit at the time, and then kind of a more established art world that you, as also I understood it, felt that you were working certainly not with or not fully in, at least.
Oh yeah, and I'm sure Nari has plenty to say on this too, but it was at that time they were parallel universes. Totally. I mean, like, none of us, excuse me, in Grand Fury had much of a place within the system. Little things, and there were other remarkable venues like White Columns, and those were supportive. But in terms of like, it was the 80s and 90s, and it was a big kind of art world going on out there, big art market, and the galleries were much kind of fewer than there are now, but Soho was very busy, and it was kind of Soho's heyday in terms of commercial galleries. But we really felt like, and we operated in a parallel universe. We were in our, wherever we could be with a Xerox copier is what we most needed. And that went on for a lot of it, most of it.
Maybe I'll turn to you, Nari, and a project that you did at the New Museum in '93 was Carpet Angel, which is a big kind of installation. Yeah. And I wonder if you could.
So the Carpet Angel was a project that I was. They had a project space in Broadway space, the Broadway building, and but the great thing was I got the opportunity because of a studio visit that kind of happened with their what I jokingly called their Harlem Safari. They came on these big buses.
You're talking about the New Museum now.
The museum, yeah. No, I mean it wasn't actually. That was much rarer to do that back in the day. That sort of going out and bringing their collectors and trustees out into the field, right? And so, no, I mean, it's a whole different time. I mean, Donald was saying. So they came, I remember this image. It's so burned and funny because I lived on my studio's on 125th Street and Lexington Avenue. And I was on the 4th floor. And I remember them, the organizing, the curator wanted to come and see what I was doing. And I had a lot of work because nobody was looking at anything anyways. So it was a good opportunity. And so they came with this big bus. And it was kind of a weird image because on my block there were methadone clinics. So there were just unfortunately call them Methadonians, like walking around aimlessly. And these guys would come out of the bus, and it was just like they were shocked. I was looking like, oh my God, are they going to be okay? And so it was a really interesting melting pot at that point. And so they came up, and it was a great visit. I had a lot of work, and they saw Carpet Angel in the studio. And so and later on, the curator asked me if I was interested in showing it in their project, which was a great opportunity.
Yeah. I wonder if you could tell a little bit about how the work came about.
Yeah, it's a kind of a strange story. I mean, so I got this. I was fortunate enough to, when I got out of grad school, I received a grant, and so I was able to stay in the studio for like a full year just working. So that was like a real luxury. So I got this studio, and a gentleman who was going away, he was traveling, Ulf Loloff, I think his name was, Swedish guy, lived like a Viking, this guy. I mean, he was kind of like a pioneer. He's like, this white guy in this building in Harlem on 125th Street back in the day. And he had this entire floor. He said, Nari, I'm not coming back. I'm fed up in New York. And all I ask you to do is take care of my paintings. So, I took over the studio. And I guess he worked in the trades, the sort of screen building, scenic buildings field. So he had all these carpets on the floor, and I hated these carpets because he had cats at one point, so there were a lot of cat hair. So I decided I was going to get rid of the carpets somehow, and I wanted to work with them. And it got in my head, it got to the point where I said, these carpets, you walk on carpets, they're kind of, in his case, there was something a little bit abject about them for me. Mm-hmm. And so I decided I wanted to make them special. And so I just started rolling them and hanging them and hanging them up. And actually the angel form, and it's not a form that I would navigate or gravitate towards, kind of came out of it. Like I put one stretch one rope and another rope, and this form kind of, this body sort of evolved, and it took me on a track. So that was really great, because I didn't really know what I was going to do with these. I knew I wanted to suspend them. This thing was on the floor, and so I wanted to have them, be off the floor somehow. Mm-hmm. So it kind of evolved into me fumbling around and trying to figure out. But the funny part of the backstory is when Ulf came back, he was furious that I got rid of his carpets. More furious about his carpets than his paintings. I secured his paintings, and they were wonderful, so he ended up kicking me out of the space after that. I think it was good reason. I mean, I think it allowed him to say, yeah, well, I'm coming back. So
yeah.
Not feel guilty.
I guess I wanted to ask in terms of like, this is also maybe relates to your practice of all, but also thinking about like a community or who was the receivers, let's say the receivers of your work, also who you thought the receivers of your work were at that time. And I know that when you were studying, like, you worked in a whole other medium, and then you kind of arrived at sculpture, and also arrived at like reusing material a lot. And it's my impression, like also really with the goal in mind, or the thought in mind, that was a very direct way to communicate with the community.
Yeah. So there's a kind of outsider sensibility to my work, but it's not really. That's really not the work. For me, it was always about finding this everyday, quotidian object, and then finding a way to transform it and make it into some other moment, some other poetic possibility for the viewer. So when I actually went to university, I was my major was drawing, and it wasn't until I moved to Harlem that I started picking up things and trying to figure out how to tell stories with them. And so that kind of happened through just being in an urban space, that was in distress, and then feeling the sense of wanting to talk to folks who were marginalized somehow, and finding these things that they were familiar with, and then figuring out that could be a starting point for a conversation.
Yeah, yeah. And maybe also that's just to kind of end on one thing that maybe also really connects to Donald, and that the work you also made in 1993 at that point, not at the new museum, but it was shown here later as part of our 1993 exhibition that took place in 2013, Amazing Grace, which was presented at the Studio Museum, which I also understand is a work that you made really with the AIDS crisis very specifically in mind.
Well, it wasn't at the Studio Museum. I collected the strollers while I was an artist in residence at the Studio Museum, but at a certain point I realized that it couldn't fit. Like the work got too big to show there. So I decided I needed to find, actually I was looking for a church to show them, because I was trying to figure out how to, because they were so heavy, so abject, that I wanted to figure out how to add another element, kind of spiritual element. So I wanted to have them in an old church. And I couldn't find a church, and it ended up, somebody told me about an old firehouse. And so I figured, saving lives in some ways, they're involved in that. So I ended up presenting it in the firehouse. But the thing about the idea for, I think that time that you talk about, you kept saying being in a double, like two worlds. And I did feel like the work, if you're doing social political work at the time, there wasn't really a lot of venues that were interested, There was White Columns. There was there was the new museum.
Exit Art? Was
Exit
Exit Art?
Yeah, Exit Art was also really good. PS1. So I think that it was, for me, it was always very, the access was always limited. So I wasn't fixated on the market. There wasn't really any inquiry into the market for me. It was more like, well, I just want to talk to the community. At least I could link up with that in terms of the rating success would be how much you can engage folks who normally don't get a chance to see contemporary art.
Yeah, I was gonna, having, in the last few days leading up to this, reminding myself of Nari's work over the years. I wanted to just make the point that in some ways we've operated in similar ways in different parts of our lives, art-making lives, and at different times we've both kind of gone to the street for both content and collection in some ways. Mine kind of very recently in terms of the contraptions to hold a painting, and Nari's just through the whole thing, I think. But then also, it seems like we've both gone to the street for audience. And I was just today, if you haven't seen Nari's Sugar Hill Smiles YouTube piece, it's a must in these dark days of our republic. It's just a great take on kind of the sour and dour Manzoni shit in a can thing. So watch it now. It's particularly timely.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I guess that in a certain sense, seeing in both of, at least also at that moment, really going out very actively and creating a community for your work.
Well, the street has always been the street has always been a kind of place for that connection to the community, but it's also always been a place for chance. Like you're never quite sure what you might see or what might this sort of found is really what might inspire you. So for me, the going around and just looking and seeing things is really rewarding, and finding distance enough to figure out how something could be something else. I think that's the hard part, because you get caught up as an artist or just human in terms of the anxiety of surviving and living, but to be able to sort of be outside and sort of this kind of doubling that you're asked to do, I think it allows one to put themselves in another place to see something fresh.
And I guess I was curious also to hear from you both at that moment, understanding that in a way, like how you ended up presenting something at the New Museum was through kind of an active outreach from the institution. And I wonder for both of you what that kind of meant, for how you
The world, you know, it meant the world. I think in a lot of ways for.
It was a real sense. It was a kind of validation in a weird way, because you know there wasn't, there weren't a lot of galleries knocking down the door, right? You know, so for
I'm
us,
still waiting for that bus tour. You know, it would be the Staten Island Safari.
I didn't want to. You know, it wasn't meant to be derogatory. It was really about them being out of context. You know, and being in this other space that they and I was trying to figure out how they were going to react. But, you know, it was interesting. It was really interesting.
Yeah, and also I wonder because in a way that I guess that maybe first presentation also became kind of at the start of what I at least can perceive as an ongoing dialogue, also in terms of kind of re-presenting or updating data and information, and also communicating that via the institution.
In terms of Grand Furies
Yes.
project.
Yes.
Without a doubt. I mean, you can say it that way. That sounds pretty good. We were just thieving the whole way. You know, you can directly pinpoint almost everything in the Let the Record Show window to work that was going on by wonderful contemporary artists of the time, like Ginny, Holzer, Barbara. You know, you can nail it. And that was, we weren't just thieves. It was expedient, which we were very much in a hurry. And this wasn't our, you know, the kind of idea of what we might do in the studio, which much of us were pursuing privately, was just a whole different matter. It didn't hold weight that there was, it didn't hold credence that there was any effort towards bringing something new into the world in terms of form.
But the new was about the context, right? I mean, that was, you were recontextualizing these things, and I think like that was really important, because the even a kind of criticality about media images,
Definitely,
you know,
yeah.
which is so necessary to talk about truth. But just to get to for me, another really important kind of juncture was the New Museum was doing they were considering a Thornton Dial exhibition. He's a folk artist and a very important folk artist. But back in the day, he wasn't as popular, perhaps. And so their dilemma was they really wanted to bring this artist into the contemporary art discourse. But they were trying to figure out how to do it. And it just so happens that, I don't know if my work was up yet, or maybe it was going to be up, but they planned it. So they asked me if I would want to go and interview Thornton Dial in Atlanta at his studio. And so I got a chance to go and meet this amazing folk artist that I've always respected and get access to him. And so it was really, that was quite special, you know, something I always remember. And the show was an amazing show that they had at the New Museum.
And what happened to that interview? Is it published?
It was video. It was a video
video.
interview, so they must have it. He must have it in the archive.
Potentially we do.
It was
That
an
would be
interesting.
nice
It was an
to
interesting.
see. Really nice to see.
Yeah, but as a young
So
man,
how long ago was that? So he's
this was in
probably
the 90s.
so he was probably in pretty good shape.
Oh yeah, no, he
in his
he hadn't even
60s,
really he hadn't even scaled up yet. Like he was still doing, you know, relatively small paintings, and then he kind of scaled up and started doing even more sculptural, you know, layered surfaces and whatnot. So he kind of hit his stride even after that too. I would like to take credit for that, but I can't. You know? No, but it was really great. And then I realized, and from looking at the catalog, that I also met an amazing artist and good friend through the new museum. I don't know why I forgot it, but Shenzhen. So they were organizing. The museum was doing a 3-person, which is absolutely crazy. They were doing a maybe it was two-person Chinese artist exhibition in like, it's crazy. Nobody does that, right? And so they were talking about their dislocation from China, and Wang Yunping was living in Paris, and Chen Zhen was also living in Paris, and so they were doing new commissions for their exhibition. And Chen needed to burn Chinese newspaper. He needed to burn a lot of Chinese newspaper. And one of the curators, Franz Moran, knew that I was working in, I was burning baseball bats in Harlem at the time. So she said, well, you're burning bats, and this Chinese artist, would you mind if he came and burned some newspaper? So I got a chance to meet Chen, and we have collaborated, and we became great friends up until his death.
Yeah.
I was wondering if I could maybe jump in there and just talk about a very early experience with the new museum, because I didn't quite make it for the start of the new museum, 77, but I arrived in New York in 78. And so, as soon as you get here, you get, I knew no one, but you get a vibe, you start hearing, and it wasn't long before it seems like, when I look back at the dates, it's like, man, I was kind of slow getting to the new museum. But Ree Morton is the first show that I remember, and it was mind-blowing, and just in its kind of anti-formalist freedom. And I've never forgotten that. I had the catalog forever. In fact, I went this morning because I was going to bring it and just show that bright red catalog from almost 40 years ago, isn't it? Yeah, it is almost 40 years. I couldn't find it. Somebody stole that classic catalog. But, it was Alan Schwartzman, who is still in the game and has done everything and has ended up at the auction houses, poor thing. But I love him still. But it was a memorable start, or that's the way I remember it. I remember that as the first show, and never forgot it.
Yeah, I guess I also wonder, like, having also talked to you both about your history with the museum and how maybe, did you also experience, I hope this is not too kind of grand, but did you also experience in a way through this institution to build up, let's say, another community for your work, maybe, than the community you were communicating with in Harlem or on the street, but becoming part of a community around the institution as well? That's certainly my sense of your ongoing kind of dialogue with the museum that started at that point.
You mean kind of through Alan Schwartzman as a lifelong friend, is that?
Or others at this institution. Or people coming
For
here.
me, it was money. I know, I'm not gonna break it down. No, it was great. They brought collectors. They were great collectors that I keep in touch with even up to now. And it allowed me time in the studio. I got a chance to stay in another year into the studio, and then I got the Studio Museum artist in residence. And so that just, and it also kind of changed, you can get despondent maybe as an artist of color. You think, oh, well, that's the art world. There's many art worlds, right? And you feel like that art world is not welcoming for my work. But when you get somebody who says, yeah, I like this, and they buy it, you say, oh, so maybe there is room for me there. So it was the beginning of this sort of awakening for me to think, because I would run across so many of older artists that were amazing, Al Loving, Mel Edwards, Jack Whitten, all these guys that back in the day, they weren't getting the light they weren't getting access. And so I was like, oh, so that's what I could expect. That's not going to happen. So you just, so when you do have an acknowledgement from an institution that says, we like this, want to show this, and you sell work, you think some things might change, and it has, it has a lot.
Yeah. And I guess I also wonder, maybe going off from that, like for both of you, like the kind of the communities that you were also kind of targeting and communicating with and thinking about that at that time, how how has your thinking then developed then over time from this point and onwards in terms of your work?
For me, it's been more choices, and I think that can be good and bad. Like back then, there weren't a lot of choices. It was just like, this is what I could do, and I could just figure out how to do this at the highest level. And and so there, in a way, that was almost kind of refreshing to say, okay, this is the rat, and you just figure out how to trailblaze that rat as readily as you can. So now, I have a lot more opportunities to do other things, and so it's been interesting in that way. It's not a bad thing, but it does make you have. I have to be much more strategic, which before I never had to be. I had to just, the train was leaving, get on the train. Now I can check the timetable and see what train and when.
Train you want.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a lot more strategizing that I didn't have to think about before.
Well, that's like my partner says. He says to young artists, it just gets harder. It just gets harder to navigate and pick the right train.
But at least you get on a train.
At least, there's a ticket office that you can go to and they'll talk to you. That's a little bit of a tough one for me because I remember specifically in the kind of really heady days of Grand Fury, and it was so consuming, and you just had this dream of getting back to your studio. Like, will that private space ever come back? And it did, but that's the reverse of audience. It's like privacy, contemplation, quiet.
But it was also different. The different time was another element, and not unlike perhaps now. There was a lot of anxiety, right? There was a lot of anxiety about
dying,
about communities that were not getting support and kind of being invisible. Mm-hmm. So I think that idea of just trying to make a mark, trying to kind of reimagine the spirits, right? Like, we was talking about like really defining the boogeyman so that you don't get scared, right? And so like the work was really about trying to figure out how to do that and how to empower yourself and the community by naming something,
Yeah, I think that's also something that really has come up. I think a lot this thing about making visible, like and giving a voice.
Right.
As I also understand it, as like a really kind of a powerful kind of generator and motivation for you also at that point and onwards.
Yeah, and that voice, there wasn't social media, so you were just adding another layer of possibility, and now the problematic space we're in is that anything can be validated through social media, through all the truths that can be projected as reality and true, so it's even more reason I feel like for artists to sort of make sure that they're involved in the conversation to bring the physicality to it, because I think that's the plane that when you talk about the street, it's also about the body in a space and the body's dialogue with material and how that material can be a conduit to talk about truth. And so for me, that's important, because the flat screen, the lighted screen can be a fiction that is dangerous. Mm-hmm. So the fact, stuff is really important to project into stuff.
Mm-hmm. So in a way, as much as this is taking something out into the streets, it's also actually kind of staying with yourself and making
right.
something, materializing something. Is that what you're saying?
Right. As a kind of baton for introspection. Like you use that experience that somebody has, it's a kind of basic experience of what that thing is, and then you figure out how to claim that thing in itself and its residue of relating to the viewer, and how that can be layered to to become a conversation about other things. But ultimately, though, it's really about, all of it is really about different possibilities that are weighed, right? Because the notion that somebody has this definitive, this definitive truth is really dangerous, and so that you get this. I'm gonna go back to transportation. This parking space, these like parking spaces that you can park into, right? We're kind of building parking spaces so that folks can, create put their experience, and then they can look at the other parking space. Then they can figure out how far they are from the doorway, And so that, for me, that's an interesting metaphor to think about the work like that.
And also when creating work today.
Yeah. Because the materiality of the object is really about claiming that parking, that area, the body's relationship to that space.
Nari, do you have a car and you park it on the street like me? It's all about parking spaces.
In New York City, it's a lifestyle. That's why it's molded into the work.
There's a lot of time to think, looking for a parking space.
Yeah, I guess maybe one last question because we're running out of time. But I guess I wanted to ask you both when you're gonna think back on that, I guess also moment in your own practice at that point today, like what do you feel that you kind of pushed, or how do you think about that moment in relation to how you work today, and what it meant?
What do you mean, the historical moments?
Yes. When you think about Grand Fury and the group of people and the conversation you were part of at that time, and what you tried to kind of push, what is that?
For me, it was always there wasn't necessarily a marketplace community, right, that I felt connected with, but I was fortunate enough to come around. My career evolved around the madness of the biennials, right? Like suddenly every country was having a biennial, and so that whole circuit was really instructional for me. It was instructional to get away from America and get another position on my experience here, but also to see artists in other places, and then see them in another, the next year. So there was almost like a circuit that we would all be on, and being on that was really instrumental, educational. It was really important for me, which a lot of people don't do now, or maybe there's a lot more cynicism towards biennials that didn't happen when they first came out.
And have you worked collaboratively? I'm getting back to the Grand Fury question. Have you?
Yeah, mostly with artists like Chen Zhen. I did something collaboratively
on specific works.
Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, if it was very difficult, Grand Fury. There were 10 headstrong, desperate, angry people. And so,
But there was no money, right?
There was no money. I mean, we actually, through, like what I was saying, the art world, can be very generous. You're referring to it. And things opened up. There was money coming our way for projects, but there was no money, and none of us really had any money. But I was just going to say, it was kind of in those days about trying to keep Grand Fury out of every other part of your life, like if you had a moment in the studio. So, that's what I would say. Grand Fury was beautiful, but it was a pain in the ass. And, it was kind of easy. It was easy to start, and it was kind of easy to end years later when we were exhausted, drunk most of the time. It was intense. And so, I finally made it back to the studio. And my studio practice is a different practice than what we did in Grand Fury. So, it's informative, absolutely, but I'm almost in a diametric way,
But I also wonder if it also was, if you feel that in a way that kind of fire that arose as a collective, that it had its moment and its relevance in time, and maybe that also moved on, and naturally you also all moved on into other kind of ventures.
That's what happened.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's clearly what happened.
Yeah.
But one of the kind of footnotes to Grand Fury's kind of disbursement was that the epidemic moved so fast and out into the world, and there was such a local nature to it in the beginning, really, in a lot of ways, that it kind of exploded across the world, and we very quickly felt uninformed, undereducated to what was happening in other parts of the country and the world. So we felt like our voice lost, brains. It lost intelligence in a way.
In terms of feeling also the need to speak for a context that was just larger than let's say, just New York City.
It outran us,
Yeah.
But that was kind of the natural progression in a way, because you became everybody's expert, right? I mean, they look to you guys for the answers.
Yeah, and that's what I mean. That's where it became very clear that our methods, our voice, were inadequate. That doesn't mean we didn't do a lot of good work before we felt inadequate. But there was a point where it was like, sheesh, we're in over our heads, frankly.
Yeah. Thank you so much, both.
Oh.